Today, Courtney, Jenna, Victoria, and myself actually will be discussing intermittent fasting as an alternative to some other fad diets such as low carb or high protein. Going right into the definition, intermittent fasting has two interchangeable terms. One, intermittent fasting, two, intermittent energy restriction. So you may see it as that in research. And it's a diet technique or religious practice that is characterized by periods of energy restriction, usually within a certain time frame. So 11 to 22 hours is an example. And also intertwined between periods of caloric intake and caloric decrease. So fasting is the voluntary withholding of food or for spiritual health or other reasons. Starvation is the other extreme. So it's an involuntary absence of food and usually is not deliberate. People who are starving don't really have time or are aware of when they're going to be eating or when or where they're going to be eating their next meal.
Just an interesting note on that, Ashley. The fasting and the starvation, while psychologically and resource difference, they are metabolically registered as probably the same by the body.
Mm-hmm. Moving into the historical roots, just as animals, we were hunter and gatherers. We didn't have access to food 24/7. Whereas the 28th century, we can see in figure 1, we were starting to have more access to food. And then by this century, we see that we have an abundance of access to food. Mm-hmm. And we can also see in figure 2 the overall amount of religions that actually practice fasting within their practice.
All right, and then we'll move on to what is the fad diet. So according to the Cleveland Clinic, a fad is something that's popular for an extended period of time, usually promising some sort of weight loss or other health benefit. So the big thing to kind of catch how to spot this is dramatic statements that are proved wrong by science. So we've all heard these before. It's been around. So why is intermittent fasting a fad? Well, it has been around for a while, but the name of it has constantly been changing. So there's different types and different names for it. But one of them is intermittent fasting. On average, people do sleep, let's say, 6 to 8 hours, and that is technically fasting because we're not eating. So if we're not eating breakfast in the morning, some people skip that meal. That's only fasting for a few extra hours past our sleeping hours, which we are burning calories while we're sleeping. We did notice that there are very many similarities in Men's Journal, Women's Health, and the Today Show, all discussing intermittent fasting. We've noticed that there's this crossover all about the timing. So in this figure 3, you can notice that there's a time for being awake and eating, and then sleeping or fasting, and then fasting at some points during the day, and how our bodies take 2 weeks to form this kind of lifestyle to get used to this fasting diet.
So moving into the 5 aspects of metabolism, we can see here in this slide the big picture of it, and then we'll go into individual mechanisms. In figure 4, you can see metabolically early fasting is characterized by a high rate of gluconeogenesis with amino acids as the primary substrates. And as fasting continues, progressive ketosis develops due to the mobilization and oxidation of fatty acids.
Right. So if we were to fast past like a daily thing, figure 5 demonstrates days of starvation, and we really shift into ketone utilization for energy, especially in the nervous system for the brain. But our intermittent fasting will stay probably within just the day-to-day fluctuations, but there's still that shift in ketones for sure.
So going into insulin and insulin-like growth factor 1 and growth hormone axis, an important function of growth hormone, besides just the control of growth, is to provide a mechanism to cope with periods of food deprivation. And the growth hormone, what happens is it stimulates lipolysis and provides free fatty acids and glycerol as the substrates for energy metabolism, and also inhibits insulin-induced suppression of hepatic gluconeogenesis, counteracting the action of insulin. So IGF-1, as you can see in figure 4, binds mainly to the IGF-1 receptors located in the skeletal muscle or hybrid insulin and IGF-1 receptors. And it has been postulated as the mediator of enhanced insulin action as it binds to insulin receptors with very low affinity.
It's important, I think, to add an early fasting that blood glucose levels begin to drop, which lead to the decrease in insulin and a rise in glucagon secretion, which we know glucagon is critical in gluconeogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
Moving to something that's pretty darn important whenever we're thinking about fasting is an effect is reduced energy expenditure. And that can be sourced from the thyroid, which is responsible for metabolism. Fasting, if we look at this cascade, when we begin with fasting, we decrease our leptin signals from adipose tissue, which would typically signal satiety. And when there's a withdrawal in leptin, there's a decrease in thyroid releasing hormone in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, and there's also decreased inhibition of this nucleopeptide Y, which is really important. This one plays a role in food behaviors and also further influences decreases in thyroid releasing hormone, thus increasing our food intake. That's how that happens. And then the thyroid releasing hormone decrease acts on the pituitary gland, or doesn't act, I should say, which causes a decrease in thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland, which results in that decrease in our T4 and T3, thus decreased metabolism.
So essentially, because leptin communicates about body fat to the central nervous system, this is just the downregulation of the HBT axis.
Yes, definitely.
Going into protein turnover, as we see a reduction in the peripheral insulin, it occurs through the decreased activation of protein kinase beta, which is key in glucose metabolism, and AS160, which increases proteolase or splitting of proteins, and decreases protein synthesis, which lowers mammalian target of rapamycin or mTOR phosphorylation, which links other proteins and regulates cell growth. In addition, mTOR as tyrosine protein kinase promotes insulin receptors, meaning muscle mass may be reduced but increased insulin sensitivity. However, this is only seen after about a 72-hour post-fasting, which is where glucose in blood increases or decreases and increases in fat oxidation or fat as fuel.
So when we reflect on those points of metabolism, I believe the overarching theme stated by Professor Mark Manson out of Johns Hopkins University is that there is a decreased reactive oxygen species presence. That's shown there in figure 9. So caloric restriction will have lower metabolic byproducts, such as superoxide and things like that. And this is said to increase longevity and actually increase stress resistance. And that's where we see some of those neuroprotective effects.
So then there's actually a small part and factor in intermittent fasting as well with the brain. So it communicates with all the peripheral organs involved in energy metabolism. Intermittent fasting enhances parasympathetic activity, which is mediated by the neurotransmitter acetylcholine in the autonomic neurons in the supply of the gut, heart, and arteries, resulting in improved gut motility. It also reduces the heart rate and blood pressure as well. So as we've stated, depleting glycogen from liver cells, fasting results in lipolysis and the generation of ketone bodies, which causes a reduction in body fat. So then we go on to our faulty logic and bad science and kind of our conclusion here. I found a quote off this blog, which is kind of typical for intermittent fasting. It helps you create a double whammy for weight loss and building a solid physique. So what are people actually eating when they are on this kind of diet? Are they eating junk food, fast food, and just, eating everything that, is full of calories, that is not nutrient dense, and everything is just high calorie? So the faulty logic here that we can say is, we can eat whatever we want in those hours of fasting and still lose weight, maintain or gain muscle. But what we see is the science shows you can lose weight and reduces neurodegenerative diseases, but while maintaining a whole food and nutrient dense diet instead.
Yeah, I think through talking with individuals who have been on this intermittent fasting diet, there may be misinterpretation of what it can do metabolically, where a lot of people think that when they're intermittent fasting in the, say, 8-hour window that they are eating, they can eat whatever they want. And to me, what comes to mind is the food matrix and how that impacts bioavailability of the nutrients. And as the science shows, you can't just eat whatever you want. You still need to focus on whole food diet, like you mentioned, Victoria, which is important, because I can't just eat McDonald's and Pizza Hut and look like the man in figure 11 here. The other interesting thing is that, of course, with technology in our society, there's an app for monitoring intermittent fasting. If you couldn't do it enough just on your own, we have science in an app form, which is really interesting. And I've had my sister use that as well. But bottom line, intermittent fasting is nothing new. The body is pretty resilient, shown with the proof of the metabolism, and it's beneficial. Fad diet of intermittent fasting is only a fad because of the definition of what a fad is. And with our science, it shows that there have been proven benefits here.
We